Juice, and Bonobos. Please welcome Talia and our data panel.
Hi, everyone. Who's ready for lunch? Too bad. You have to stick with us for 30 minutes. No, we have a really great panel that I think you're going to find really insightful. We have two amazing panelists. To my left is the irrepressible.
Steve calls me, I guess.
Don't forget your mic. Irrepressible Thom Kennon, who is SVP of Strategy at RAPP. He's worked on everything from credit cards to cosmetics, and is also an adjunct professor at NYU, as in strategy or social and brand. And then to his left is John Turner, who was formerly on the brand side at P&G and Philip Morris, and is now head of analytics at Mediahub, working on Scott's, Miracle-Gro, Remy, Whole Foods. And both these guys have a lot to talk about, so let's jump right in. So data is the new oil. And earlier it was said that data is also a lubricant. So we're going to talk today about how data is lubricating our ability to reach our consumers, and with a specific focus on the human side of things. So I think what these guys bring to the table is that human insight of not just looking at mountains of data, but how do we actually interpret it. So the first question for you, Thom, is what kind of data is most useful for CPG brands?
It's obviously it's probably one of the questions that brought you guys here today. We look at things. I look at things, and the people I work with look at things a little bit differently than many in the room, perhaps. And you know, right now I'm helping with RAPP on strategy. I also teach, and I also got a little startup on the side called Forge. And what I've learned over the years is that we have come on a journey, businesses and brands, that is, I think, at an inflection point where we are not going to be able to advertise our way out of it. And by that I mean something very specific when it comes to data. We look at data, we call it front-end data. We call it, if you look at the stack of tech and data, it's the top. And it's about, we think, as opposed to the back end or the last several inches or feet of data, which is, I think, what most of us think about when it comes to broadcast media, or when it comes to the types of things we do that when we buy via CPM and GRPs, we look at data from the front end, and we think that that's infinitely more valuable. And so we call it human AI or human intelligence, and it's a layer that sits on top of all the other things that everybody else is using in our data lakes and response analytics and econometric data and listening data. But on top of that is a diagnostic team. And those folks are charged with coming up with fresh insights, because if we're right and that we're not going to be able to build and sustain and competitively grow our brands by way of traditional advertising over the coming generation, then we think we need a different kind of cannon, a different kind of gun, a different kind of weapon. And we think that that data on the front end, that human intelligence layer, is the weapon that's required.
John, what's your view?
Yeah, at Mediahub, we tend to think a lot more from the consumer perspective at the start. So we always start with a deep set of insights on the consumer and how that consumer interacts with the brand, and uncover the key insights that will drive the business. So when we look at that, we've discovered what are the areas of capturing demand and what are the areas of creating demand among those consumers. Within capturing demand, it's all about efficiency and customization of the data stack. No, we basically do not have, like the big media holding companies, a complete data stack that we just go and plug into for every client. We actually design it for each client throughout to drive efficiencies, make sure that we know which pieces of data we're pulling in. So for someone like Scott's, we're looking at data signals like weather. So we do weather-triggered advertising. Weather drives whether or not you're going to go and work on your yard, plant your lawn, do anything like that, and a ton of other signals. But we also have an innovation piece, because millennials are not that into gardening. And that's a big, I know that's no great insight, but it's a big problem for a company like Scott's. So we have to figure out a way is what are the areas where millennials will interact with the garden in a way that we can then go and capture them, get them into gardening, getting into the backyard space. And the big insight we had was that while for boomers, it was all about image and presentation, having the perfect lawn, for millennials, it was all about experience and what they actually did in the backyard. And so tapping into when the backyard was useful for entertaining, for sports, etc., how do we manage to hit those and get those to be the entry points in? So you build two completely different data stacks for the creativity and the capture that you need to do. So that's sort of where we think about it.
Yeah, I love the case, and again, it resonates deeply with our approach. The corollary to, and again, it's a conceit that I believe is true, and hopefully we come to recognize it, because it will force us to do some very different things if we believe that we're not going to be able to advertise our way out of these business problems we have as brands. I love where John and his business takes this, which is into this idea of fresh insights, because I don't think the advertising insights that we used to use are going to get us out of this jam either, applied to fresh and different types of experience planning or value for marketing for our customers. We love anybody in this room who's ever pitched to their boss or pitched to their client knows that you almost always never win without something that is very, very powerful, which is something they didn't know yet. Okay? Inevitably. You win by bringing something that they didn't know before you walked in that door. And in our case, what we believe is that is insight. And recently we worked with, we brought in a new account because of our insight that we brought to them in a pitch. And it was a very large credit card company who it was being threatened by competitors and threatened by the cultural pressure of what we know to be this increasing age of precarity around us. And so we went and did some research, and we did some, we went to econometric research, we did some census data research, we did some applied listening. We have this model called applied listening, where we create taxonomies. It's not self-reported, it was sort of eavesdropping, right? We create taxonomies of language, and we scrape the great networks, and we put that into a database, and we analyze it, and we tokenize it, and we dedupe it, and we cleanse it, and we model it. And we see stuff we didn't see before. Unlike traditional research, you will find things you weren't looking for. And what we found was this idea of redlined for that consumer that they were targeting. It wasn't just that they were time-starved. It wasn't just that they were economic trouble. These people had felt completely abandoned. And they're not used to getting offered credit cards anymore, or they're not used to getting accepted anymore. And so the insight we did was attach that to this precarity idea, this cultural tension. We walked in the room and we developed a whole different, and on the back of that win, we developed a whole different campaign, which is now in market. And then to us, that's what's required, that kind of fresh insight about the target, about how we're going to bring that together with the brand in a moment of value that didn't exist before.
Yeah, that also works from a media perspective. We created a group called, it's called the R&D group, Radical and Disruptive. And it really came from our work with Netflix, who were trying to drive a new way of watching television. I know that's not good for agencies, but as their client, we wanted to get people to start watching shows. And we did this deep consumer insight dive into the target audience for, I don't know if anyone's watched Black Mirror, the sort of dark side of tech. What we found was that audience was highly technically sophisticated, which meant they had a lot of ad blockers, which meant how do you advertise to a group who are smarter than you and have ad blockers and don't want to see your content? So what we ended up doing with them was we actually went to some of the key sources of data, publications that they were actually interested in and sites they went to, and actually negotiated a custom buy where we actually hard-coded the ad into the site load so that when the target audience went on site, it came up looking like an ad, but it wasn't an ad. And then we did that in a very limited buy, but it created huge buzz because the tax savants were all like, how are these guys serving me ads? And then we began to push through and drove an enormous amount of earned media around how that was actually being done. We fed little breadcrumbs into some of the conversations going on in social. And we got sort of 5 or 6 times the earned media from the paid media. But the key thing there is the data that we used was going back and understanding that audience well enough to know what would get them engaged. Because fundamentally, The thing that causes brands to decline is not lack of awareness, it's indifference. People just not being able to think about you. You've got to get people to be engaged.
I think that is such a great example because it also highlights something else that we spoke about, which is the idea that the best data sources come from not self-reported, which is often survey-based, limited, based on the individual's perception of their behaviors, which is not necessarily reality. So I think to both of your points, that we can't advertise our way out of this challenge that the CPGs are facing, but how do we find new ways of tapping into observed behaviors? And I think one of the other challenges that we're up against is now with GDPR and sort of the crackdown on data sources. So how do each of you see our ability to continue to use data, continue to personalize, as we know that's so important to driving engagement and consideration? How do we balance that need for personalization with privacy laws?
I'll go first. In the spirit of bringing things fresh to brands and having them to give you a chance to work with them, we recently brought on a new account that it's there to very large an increasingly larger and more salient cosmetics brand.